Hello everyone and welcome. I was asked to give my thoughts on Breath of the Wild 2 and how much AMD's Fidelity Fx would actually improve the graphics. I'll try to have video of examples showing this on screen as we go more in depth on everything, but it's important to remember, even if the sequel doesn't use it, Breath of the Wild 2 may already have better performance and a higher resolution. And we will show a lot of comparison examples of this as well. And a small warning, as this video is all about the graphical improvements with frame rates and resolution and everything, we will be using numbers. Some have asked, why would Nintendo need to use this on Breath of the Wild 2? Didn't Breath of the Wild 1 already run perfect on the Switch, 1080p at 30 frames per second? And technically, no. Especially not on release. The Switch ran the game at a dynamic resolution of 900p, not 1080p, and it was just barely able to do that. The dynamic scaling could bring it down closer to 800, about halfway between 900p and the standard 720p. While it did run at 30 frames per second, a lot of the time you were actually in the mid-20s, and in certain areas like Korok Forest, it would even drop to as low as 15 to 20 frames and be very laggy. So there are times while you're playing where it'll be closer to 720p and half of its original frame rate. For handheld mode, this resolution can drop from 720 to 648, in which case it technically isn't even HD anymore. And there are other games like Doom, Xenoblade 2, or Witcher 3 are known to drop to around 360p. That's lower than the GameCube, Wii, and even some Nintendo 64 games, making it close to the Super Nintendo or the Nintendo 3DS. Similar to what I believe will likely happen for Breath of the Wild 2, the second Doom game, Doom Eternal, released on Switch just 2.5 years after the first. The game should be even more difficult to run, with almost everything having way more polygons, higher resolution textures, better lighting, larger areas, and much more. Normally, you would think this would make it run at an even lower resolution or frame rate, but it stays closer to a higher resolution and frame rate most of the time. If a third party was able to optimize Doom Eternal this well for the Nintendo Switch in just over 2 years, imagine what Nintendo could be doing with Breath of the Wild 2 after 5 years of development. And remember, Breath of the Wild was being designed from the ground up to run on the Nintendo Wii U, not the Switch. It only began being ported to the Switch less than a single year before its release, and this was at the same time the team was also working on the Wii U version. At Breath of the Wild's launch, fans made complaints about some of the frame rate issues and lagging, which Nintendo immediately began working to fix. They released an update after only 1 month, which increased performance by a lot. The game stays closer to 900p and 30 frames per second for most of the game, but still has occasional drops in certain areas. After 5 years, and now that the team actually has experience with the engine and the Nintendo Switch, as well as being able to optimize it for a single console and not focus on 2 different console versions, I think Breath of the Wild 2 could see even more of a performance boost than we've seen with the previous example from Doom Eternal. I think Nintendo would have the skills to improve textures, lighting, details, and more, while still allowing the game to reach a full 1080p at 30 frames per second, or remain at 900p and reach 60 frames per second. Maybe that sounds ambitious, but it seems to actually be true. If we look closely at the gameplay in the trailers, we can see grass and other objects with more detail and rendering out further than in the original, instead of fading away or disappearing after just a short distance. A look at Death Mountain seems to show an even bigger difference. In the original, it barely has any detail, just the outline. However, the sequel shows it much more clearly. Another massive improvement showing off the increased depth of field is this scene showing the Tabantha region from one of the Sky Islands. Textures seem to have improved all throughout the trailers. The detail in the volumetric clouds are a huge improvement. Lastly, the lighting seems to have been upgraded as well. You would think all of these improvements would cause a game that's already struggling to stay at a constant 900p and 30 frames per second end up running closer to a constant 20 frames per second. But despite all of the improvements and details, it is surprising to see the entire trailer running at a consistent 30 frames per second. People have even zoomed in and counted each pixel using the method from Digital Foundry, and most believe it is actually a full 1080p. Let's just hope the final game doesn't have any downgrades. Would it be possible for the sequel to run both 1080p and 60 frames per second though, just as Skyward Sword HD does? Well, technically, yes. That is where Fidelity Fx comes in, and why people have been excited about it coming to Switch. To put it simply, Fidelity Fx is an AI program that can artificially increase the graphics, allowing for both higher resolution and frame rates. A quick hypothetical example with Breath of the Wild 2. If after all of the optimization for Switch, it would normally be able to only reach 1080p and 40 frames per second or 45 frames per second. Again, hypothetical. This would mean Nintendo would most likely lock the game at 30 frames per second to make it as smooth as possible with no stuttering. To reach that full 1080p and 60 frames per second, the game's normal resolution could be set back to 900p or 720p. Then Fidelity Fx would be used to boost the 900 or 720p up to 1080p and 60 frames per second. No, it wouldn't look as great as a normal 1080p game, but it would still look better than a 900p game and much better than a 720p game. And it would be running way smoother with no lagging or chugging. Some might say this is dumb, Nintendo doesn't care about graphics, they wouldn't do this. But they already began, now that Switch Sports is releasing, and they have already updated plenty of games in a similar way that they did with Breath of the Wild, which improved its graphics and frame rate, as we mentioned earlier. Plus, while it is common to hear gamers say Nintendo doesn't focus on graphics, Nintendo has also been known to brag about how great their graphics are. To make a quick and simple recap, with Nintendo able to better optimize the sequel for a single console, they could already be able to have it go from the original's 900p and 30 frames per second, which would dip to almost 720p and below 20 frames per second, to a steady 900p and 60 frames per second or 1080p and 30 frames per second. However, even if that isn't the case, none of it changes, and it stays the same. They could still use Fidelity Fx to make it 1080p and 60 frames per second, though I do think 1080p and 30 frames per second will be more likely how it will release. Or maybe I'm just hoping for it to be. I hope that was easy enough to understand. I know we had a lot of numbers, but a lot of people were making videos or articles on Nintendo using this to make Switch graphics better without properly going into detail and explaining what it actually is or does. Just that it makes games look better, or it can make any game 1080p and 60 frames per second, which is a little misleading. It will make the actual resolution 1080p, so you don't have as many jagged edges or pixelation, and add more detail. But it doesn't look as great as a true 1080p image, though it would still look a lot better than the 900 or 720p resolutions, and give you a large boost in frame rate as well. So let me know, would you be a fan of this? Would you want Nintendo to apply it to older games? Which would you like to see? And thank you for watching. We have a few new Patreon supporters that I would like to give a thank you to. If you would like your own shout out, then head over to patreon.com/GameOverJesse, where you can receive a ton of different rewards while helping us out. Those of you who are just donating a single $1, that really does help more than you would think. Thank you Monica Spath, NORNARB, Shadow to Us, SoberRx, 𝗟𝗏𝗄𝐽, Natsu, Rusty Caulfield, Zoe M, Candy, David Guthman, Ashton Wren, BKRS7, Blargnar, Chad Costin, Gus Calvo, Henry, Jesse Birch, Jesse Wood, Jon Snow, Larulian Sheep, Lovable Christie, Mr. Monocled Metroid, Super NX64, and ZAIN.